Hi there, in this video, I'm going to give you an example about the different types of evidence and try to measure the reliability of the evidence, the experience of the auditor with that evidence, and the internal control of the client. So with this in mind, let us talk about the 8 different types of evidence, and then the objectivity of evidence, the independence of the provider. Who is providing the evidence? Is it the client or customers or suppliers or the auditor himself? The qualification of the provider, is it provided by the secretary or provided by the accounting manager or provided by independent party? How big are the qualifications of the provider? The auditor's knowledge of the item, and then the effectiveness of the internal control. So how about the inquiry? If the auditor goes and asks the client about some information, is it objective? We say it's low to high because it depends. When we ask a question and we get a reply from the management, we don't really give it a high objective level because it depends on the situation and the information. Is the provider, who is the client in this case, is he independent or she independent? We say no, because if the client is giving me the information, the independence factor is absent here. So there is low level of independence. If I get it from the bank or the customer or a supplier of that client, then it will have high independence. If I get the information from the client himself, there is no independence here. The qualification of the provider, which person in the client organization is giving me this answer? Is it the secretary or the accountant or the CFO or the CEO? So the qualification of the responder here differs. The auditor direct knowledge is very low because the auditor doesn't know the answer. And this is the reason the auditor is raising up inquiry to the management. The effectiveness of the internal control is not applicable here in this situation because we ask a question, get the answer, and it has nothing to do with the internal control. So this is the first test, which we call it inquiry. And those are the different parameters we need to keep in mind as auditor when we get the reply. This is the reason in my previous video, I say inquiry by itself is not good evidence unless we have another evidence to support it. Another one, inspection. For the inspection, the objectivity here is high. Why? Because here we inspect a document. When I ask a question and I get an answer, there is lots of variation here. But if I check a document, there is no room for raising doubt because this information is written in a document. So the objectivity is high. But the independence, it differs. Why? Because if I get this document from external party like bank or customers or supplier, are more independent than internal documents. The qualification of the provider, it differs because it depends on which person who gave me this document. If the person himself is qualified, then I will trust that document. So this is the qualification of the person who gives me the document. The auditor's direct knowledge is low. We ask for that document because we don't know the answer for the information, so we ask for document. The internal control here, it differs from one situation to the other. The observation, where the auditor goes physically and watch out the operation. Here the objectivity is medium because the auditor will rely on his eyes, not on a document. So this is the reason the observation doesn't have high objectivity because it depends on the eyesight of the auditor and not on something in writing. However, the independence is very high because the auditor is observing the operation by himself. So there is no room for doubting here. The qualification of the provider is high because it's the qualification of the auditor. The auditor knowledge is very high because here the auditor himself is aware of what's going on, but the internal control of the client differs from one situation to the other. In the same way, we see performance and physical examination. We see here the objectivity is higher, the independence is higher because both observation, re-performance, and physical examination are run by the auditor himself. And this is the reason the qualifications here are higher than the previous ones. The auditor knowledge is higher than the previous one, and so on. When we come to recalculation, it's also the same because the auditor is recalculating everything by himself. But when we come to confirmation, it differs because we get the confirmation from a third party, like the customers or banks or custodian or suppliers. So yes, it is objective because it comes in a document. The person who's providing the information is independent from the client. The qualification is really high, but the auditor's direct knowledge is low because he doesn't know the number. He's getting confirmation from somebody outside the process. The analytical procedures, it differs here from one situation to the other. Also, the independent of the provider, it differs. Is it the auditor or the client who's doing the procedures? The qualification here of the provider is usually high. The auditor knowledge is low because the auditor is trying to run the analysis to get more insights about the information. And finally, the internal control situation, it differs. I hope you find this example useful to help you to understand the differences among all the 8 different types of evidence and their objectivity, independence of the provider, qualification of the provider, and the awareness of the auditor. Thank you so much. And I will continue my discussion about the audit evidence in the coming videos.